Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, with the Return to World event in full swing in Monster Hunter World, and the game recently hitting over 100,000 peak players on Steam, and Steam being a relatively unpopular way to play the game given keyboard and mouse controls are a bit of a problem, and the game originally released on consoles 7 months before coming to PC, so a lot of the more committed people are over on the consoles, and we don't really have player metrics for console, so it's easy to assume that the player base just as a whole has really kicked up a ton, using the Steam charge as an example. That said, this surge contains a lot of returning players, and even a bunch of new players too. And one thing that every new player wonders, and honestly even returning players too when starting a new playthrough, is what weapon should I use? Which one is right for me? Which will I enjoy the most? And which will bring me the most success? Well, here's a handy dandy flowchart that I put together if you want a really quick answer, but with tons of people starting new playthroughs, I thought it would be the perfect time to go over the weapons, explain their concepts a little bit, their strengths and their weaknesses in a rapid fire manner as quickly as I can for each one, while also doing it in order of the easiest to hardest to actually come to grips with. Not necessarily the easiest or hardest to master as a weapon completely, but ones that will take a lot less time to just feel comfortable using, and the actual progression part of the game in the first place will of course be labeled as easy, so you can start paying more attention to the monster in front of you and less to the weapon combos. Also keeping in mind that some weapons get a lot more comfortable with weapon skills, so I'll be judging them on their base self, no skills added, and talking mostly about how they feel to advance through the early and mid game before you have an actual set put together. The idea being, hopefully this will help any new players make their choice, or even if any returning players are considering trying something different, hopefully this pushes you towards something that you'd enjoy as well. Without further ado then, let's begin with the easiest weapon in my opinion, sword and shield. From bottom to top, this weapon's mantra is comfort. While there are of course more advanced technical maneuvers and combos with the weapon, the standard spam primary attack combo is actually really great. It can link into the secondary attack combo for an even longer chain that does blunt damage and can stun monsters, and if you press both buttons at the same time, you can legitimately just turn your angle of attack mid-combo, which is awesome to let you continue combo chains. The idea being you walk up to a monster, you start a combo, and you can just keep comboing until the monster moves away or tries to hit you. Even if it moves a little bit, you have a directional spin to follow it and keep the damage up, which is fantastic. On top of that, as dinky and tiny as it is, you do have a shield. It can block most attacks, which is a great option to have while learning to dodge properly within this game. As well, while holding your shield up, you can use consumables without sheathing your weapon, which no other weapon in the game can do. This will save your life, and it can actually help you save the lives of other hunters in multiplayer as well, which is awesome. The true fun of the weapon, in my opinion, comes when you start to work in the charged backstep move, the falling bash, and the perfect rush combo, but those are a bit more advanced. The basics I mentioned though will get you through a lot of hunting as you adjust to more advanced techniques, and it can do it without a lot of practice required. Greatsword was a bit of a hard one to rank here, because it is sort of simultaneously on both extremes. The whole idea of this weapon is big number, infrequent hit, actually connecting attacks with monsters less often than pretty much any other weapon, but doing equivalent or greater damage over time just because the hits themselves are so meaty. As a result, you are honestly expected to miss with this weapon a fair amount. The game is balanced around greatsword users not hitting every single swing, so when you do hit everyone, it gets really good. What I mean is, don't feel bad when you miss. Draw attacking is also perfectly viable and an entire way to play the game that is fun, but True Charge Slash is more enjoyable in my opinion. Either way, the weapon heavily focuses on the concept of charging your attacks. Holding down the primary attack button charges, each level doing more damage than the last. While the weapon does have access to other things like horizontal slashes, these are generally very rarely used. The main buttons that you need to know are primary attack for the charged vertical slash combo, and secondary attack while charging does a shoulder tackle. That tackle has hyper armor, so you don't get flinched by attacks, and it also reduces the damage you take from them significantly, and it also pushes you forward in the primary attack combo, making it really strong. Greatsword can also put the weapon in front of them to guard like a shield, but generally that is seen as far less effective than a shoulder bash once you get your timing right on those, but it's a nice safety net to actually have access to. Essentially, your success with this weapon boils down to your understanding of where to stand and when in a fight, of a monster's moveset and their timings. The difficult part of that is the first time that you fight something, you may well struggle with this. The good part of it though is that it puts all of your attention on the monster and not on the weapon you're using, which means that you will learn the basics of the game as a whole and the monster that you're fighting a whole lot faster than someone who is using Charge Blade, for example, who has to focus on their own weapon a lot more to actually get what they need out of it, and I think that is a big plus for beginners picking up a greatsword. Dual blades are sort of the antithesis of greatsword. Blindingly fast strikes, piddly little numbers. If the numbers don't matter to you and you just like cool animations and comfortable gameplay, then dual blades may be the answer for you. Like Sword and Shield, it of course has more technical combos, but dual blades can pump out a ton of damage even with just basic combos. This is the first weapon we've talked about that can't guard, and it also has access to Demon Mode, which flings your weapons into a backhanded grip, makes you Naruto run around like you've always dreamed of doing, and increases your damage a bunch, while simultaneously draining your stamina constantly. This stamina drain can be rough for new players to get used to, to, but it does also force you to learn about the stamina mechanic of the game in general, which is important to come to grips with early. Long term, this weapon becomes just as much about positioning as Greatsword is, but at a much sort of faster pace. Less recovery animations, less rooted to the spot, more you just have to actively increase the speed of your inputs to keep up with the fight in front of you, and use your knowledge of the exact distance that each of your attacks travels to stick to a monster. Oh, and also you can Beyblade down monster spines, which is literally always enjoyable. Hammer is the one that I'd put next here. A lot of people consider this sort of Greatsword light. It is focused around big hits, it has charge attacks, but there are important differences to consider here too. Hammer is more combo focused than singular attack focused like Greatsword, with the big damage numbers coming at the end of a couple of your different combos. The charge attacks on this weapon mostly are just a utility thing more than anything, because unlike Greatsword, you can charge Hammer while moving, and so essentially the way to play it in this game is whenever you are running, charge the weapon so you can unleash a big hit when you actually reach the monster. Then if you are standing beside the monster, you want to use your actual proper combos. Hammer also does stun damage if you hit monsters in the head, which is great to teach you the concept of hit zones, which is different monster parts being weak or strong against different damage types and also different statuses like stun. The moveset then is generally simple. It has strong environmental interactions with jump attacks, slide attacks, wall attacks, all being high damage and easy to do, and it simply requires less commitment than Greatsword does, with a lot of the same satisfaction to offer, but it has less defensive options. No blocking, no shoulder tackle, but instead it has much higher movement ability, so if you like big hits and satisfying large slams, but prefer the concept of dodging with position to guarding or tackling, this is pretty much the perfect weapon for you. Oh, and bonus, given we are talking about Monster Hunter World, Hammer is essentially the only weapon that people agree across the board got a really cool Clutch Claw combo attack when the Clutch Claw was added into the game, so bonus points for that. Then we have Lance. I didn't want to place this one too early to give people the wrong idea, but Lance is in fact incredibly easy to come to grips with, at least early on. Essentially, this weapon is a gigantic hulking shield and a big pokey stick, and the way you use it is by sticking the giant shield in front of your face so nothing can hurt you, and then doing little thrusts with the lance itself to actually do the damage. The weapon is the turtle weapon of Monster Hunter. It is heavily defensively focused, and a lot of players find the gameplay loop quite tedious, as essentially your goal is to block every single attack the monster does and then just poke non-stop until the next time that you need to block. It isn't particularly flashy looking, there isn't a massive amount of thought required to go into it, and while it is easy in concept, there is quite a lot to master when it comes to positioning with such a heavy weapon, and perfecting the art of when to block and when to poke. You also have a couple of counters which are quite fun to play with, but most gameplay will be block or poke. For this reason, I often don't recommend this to new players because it's just sort of different than the playstyle of the other weapons, but if it sounds like it speaks to you, then you should go for it. There's nothing wrong with having one weapon that you just love above everything else and just playing it exclusively. You just, might miss out on the fun of the other weapons. Then we have Longsword, and this is an extremely popular weapon choice. This weapon is, well, a gigantic katana. If that sounds like something that you're into, then you've probably already made your choice because this weapon embodies that entirely. You have some fun basic attack combos, you use that to build your spirit bar, which then lets you use the spirit combo, which is a strong attack combo that increases your spirit gauge, changing the color of the bar as a whole. Each new color of the bar represents a general damage buff, with white, orange, and red being the progressing levels of it. These have a timer on them that will slowly deplete and needs replenishing, and you can also spend your spirit gauge levels on special attacks like Helmbreaker, which is flashy as all hell and does a ton of damage too. On top of this, Longsword has access to multiple parries, one of which needs more setup, but the other one can literally interrupt attack animations to enter, which makes it incredibly comfortable as a way of playing. Essentially, you can just focus on that parry, use it to level up your spirit gauge, and then use Helmbreaker at full spirit gauge and play that way on repeat. That playstyle is super easy, super effective damage-wise, and will have a similar effect to the earlier mentioned weapons where you are spending your time paying more attention to the monster than to your weapon, as parrying as a concept inherently makes you pay closer attention to what the monsters are doing. After that, let's talk about Bow. This is the first of the ranged weapons that I have on this list, and while being ranged does have inherent advantages as you get a bigger picture of the area in the fight, as well as more space to work with when avoiding monster attacks, Bow itself is very agile with its movements, and its main gameplay loop is based around the idea of shot levels. You can charge your bow shots to reach maximum charge level and fire off their strongest version, or alternatively, every time you fire arrows successively, you go up one charge level on the attack, so you can charge by attacking. The only reason that you wouldn't do this is something called coatings, which are something that you have a limited amount of in between resupplies, and alter the effects and damage of your shots. As well, Bow has access to a fun spread shot follow-up to its more rapid shots, and also has a fun interaction where when you do a dodge while charging a bow shot, you go up one bonus charge level, and so Bow gameplay often winds up looking like a blitzingly fast archer, dashing circles around their foe, aiming the arrows at the weak spots of the monster while being impossible to hit. Also, you get Dragon Piercer as an attack, which is just a badass special move. It definitely has a different feel to the other weapons, but it is more familiar than the next couple of them. Light Bowgun is, for all intents and purposes, a gun. Yes, lore-wise, wise, they are heavily engineered automatic crossbows that fire ammo produced from various kinds of nuts that have different effects, which is really cool, but gameplay wise, it feels like you're using a gun. If that's what you want, then one of the two bowguns will probably be for you. Light bowgun's special attack is it gets mines that it can drop on the floor, which explode either when a monster attacks them, or if a player attack connects with them, doing loads of bonus damage to monsters that are actually close to them. Light bowguns tend to be ridiculously more agile than their heavy counterpart, with faster movement just in general, faster movement while firing, some pretty long-range dodge rolls, and also just much more wieldy weapons just generally speaking. Less recoil, less reload time, but also less damage. Just easier and more comfortable to actually use, and in actuality, whichever you are more comfortable with will always do more damage for you. As for heavy bowgun then, this weapon can be modified to have a shield on it that you can essentially just block with its actual out-of-holster movement speed being slow as hell, so you sort of need that. Essentially, greatsword level movement speed. But that is because it is the greatsword of ranged weapons, and this thing feels more like an anti-tank rifle or a minigun compared to the light bowgun. A lot of your strongest ammo types will route you to the spot or limit your movement significantly. You will often, especially without skills, find yourself rooted on the spot while reloading or even shooting, but you have a ton of damage potential, the shield option, and you have two special attacks to choose between, one of which is a literal minigun for a bit, and the other is a single massive piercing sniper shot that explodes afterwards. Generally speaking, I would say the bowguns are some of the most gear-reliant weapons in the game, by which I mean that what they gain from endgame gear isn't just pure damage or pure defense, they gain actual functionality of the weapon, with proper ability to change the full-on comfort of using them in a ton of different aspects. So playing either of these two weapons while progressing it is a totally different experience than it is playing them at endgame, and that is important to be aware of, not to mention ammo management is much harder to do early on, before you can craft and buy whatever you need before a hunt later in the game. After that then, let's talk Gunlance. This is another big, meaty shield and lance weapon, but unlike its earlier compatriot, it has higher burst damage options, but also much longer recovery frame periods. Essentially, this is just a giant gun stick with a big shield, and so when you use it, there is a lot more management going on than the standard lance. You have different types of gun lance that have different firing styles, some of which can charge the shots for longer range, some just have a huge spread but high damage close range, and some that have a lot of ammo before a reload is required, but also offer a unique gameplay style due to Gunlance actually having a move that can unload its full magazine in one go. This one can be a challenge for a beginner to take on, or even just early on in the game without skills, but it has some of the most consistent damage of any weapon early on, because at least when using shells, it doesn't care about hit zones, which means if you are going for pure shelling, you will have super consistent output. However, that said, that can also breed some bad habits for other weapons if you are brand new, so while I think this weapon is absolutely worth using, and it does have quite a bit of technical aspects you have to learn, I generally wouldn't advise it as your first weapon. It can be easy to use at first for sure, but it takes a ton of skill to master, and the skills that you have to learn to master it don't really easily transfer to other weapons. Then we have the switch axe. This is essentially a giant axe that turns into a giant sword. The axe attacks are very wild, dangerous looking, savage, smashy, and the sword attacks are very elegant, practiced, and precise. As a weapon, it is very fun to look at, and I can see a lot of people gravitating towards it when trying the game out for the first time. The core of the weapon is its transforming nature and how you use it, as if you time it right, even the transformation of the weapon is an attack in itself that can do a load of damage. Essentially, you have two different gauges to manage with this weapon. The inner bar represents how much sword energy you have. Without sword energy, you can't enter sword mode. Attacking in sword mode drains this bar, and it regenerates over time with axe mode hits on monsters as well. Attacking in sword mode, however, will also fill an outer gauge on the bar. Once that gauge is full, sword mode damage is heavily boosted for a time, including the special move where you latch onto the monster's body and perform zero-sum discharge, an extremely cool explosion move where you spam the button and then fly off propulsed by your own thrust. A very, very fun attack for sure. Of course, overall, the management of these things, as well as the wild swing axe buff that was added in Iceborne, makes this a bit of a tougher weapon to approach for newer players, but in reality, it's sort of just timers to be aware of more than anything that you have to actively manage and overthink. On which note, after that, I have Insect Glaive. This weapon can be extremely simple, but if it is, it means you're not using it properly. Essentially, for the weapon to be fully functional, you need to constantly have 3 buffs active. You get these buffs by shooting your bug companion at the monster, and different body parts will give you different colors of buff. Red buff increases the damage that you do and gives you access to other parts of your moveset. White buff increases movement speed and unlocks more aerial attacks for your moveset, and orange buff boosts your defenses. All 3 active together also have some further bonuses, so you pretty much just want to have all of them all the time. They do disappear on a timer though, so every 90 seconds or so without skills, you have to actively rebuff yourself before you can attack again properly. Outside of that, the gameplay is actually relatively simple and very enjoyable, and you get to have a cool bug that follows you around and helps you out. Essentially, the question here is, do you have the patience to frequently manage your buffs in order to hunt properly, or will you just go Unga Bunga mode with it? Because if you go Unga Bunga mode with it, it's not really worth it. If if you don't, however, and you actually take the time to understand it, it's really good, and it's not even the most difficult to understand. And again, that leads us to our next weapon, second hardest weapon to learn in my opinion, Hunting Horn. And this is of course specifically the World and Iceborne version of it. Essentially, there are just a metric truckload of things to think about and have on your mind for effective Hunting Horn gameplay in this game. But it is also conceptually my favorite weapon out of all of them, a giant bonking stick that you use to play music, and that music buffs you and also any allies that you have around. But also the way that you play music is by attacking the monster. So essentially each of your 3 basic attack choices are a different color of note, and you create songs by comboing the notes together correctly. But also most of your attacks have different animations depending on which direction your left stick is pointing, and those have a massive impact. Once you have played the right notes, you then need to perform your melody, which is a relatively long animation with very low movement speed during it, but it also does good damage if you attack the monster with it. And if you want to increase the potency of the buffs, you can also encore it, which basically just doubles that animation length to give you stronger buffs. Unlike the insect glaive, the way that you get these buffs is baked into how you do damage with the weapon, so it sort of works with just fighting in normal, but also the buffs are much harder to actually manage, and the weapon is balanced around you always having everything up, as that is your expected state of being. It's difficult, it is slow, but it's very heavy hitting and extremely rewarding and satisfying, especially in group play where you can buff your allies too. Then finally we have the Charge Blade. This weapon is awesome, transforming from sword and shield into a gigantic elemental axe that can even become a saw blade, which is even cooler in my personal opinion. This weapon has even more things to think about at any given time than Hunting Horn or any other weapon does, and that's why I think it is essentially the least beginner friendly of them all. If you start with this weapon, you will be constantly thinking about the weapon itself, less so about your general movement, less so learning the monster's patterns, and as a result, it will take you a lot longer to get a hold of the basics of the game that you're playing, which is why I recommend using something simpler to start off with for at least the first couple of hours before diving headfirst into Charge Blade. That said, it is an extremely rewarding weapon for the amount of learning that you have to put in. It is very satisfying with its guard points, which are essentially counters. It has a file system that you have to charge by attacking monsters. You can load files into your shield to boost your defenses and increase your options in axe mode too, and essentially sword and shield mode sort of exists as an effective way to charge your files. Then axe mode exists as your primary way to spend the files. But this weapon has about 4 different timers you have to stay on top of as well, and it even has different moveset speeds too, like your literal movement speed is different depending on the mode that your weapon is in, and a lot of very tight timing window interactions with the weapon too. Essentially this just requires the most time spent just to actually understand and learn the weapon properly, but it is absolutely worth it if it does interest you, and it's one of the most satisfying weapons in my opinion, especially the World and Iceborne version of it. And that does it for today then everyone, just a nice run through and breakdown as quick as possible of each of the 14 weapons, what they do, what they feel like, how they feel early game as opposed to later on, and the learning curve that you can expect. This doesn't mean that you should avoid playing any of the weapons based on anything that I've said here. They are all generally great, and if it speaks to you, you should play it. This is just to help you pick with actual knowledge to go from, especially for new players. Again, there's this flowchart that I made. Of course, it's a little bit silly, but I did make it with the intention of it actually being helpful. So while this video is the long answer to the question, I think of the flowchart as a sort of short answer. So of course, feel free to refer back to it as needed. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and hopefully it's helped you out a bit, because I always just love to see people trying out new weapons in this series. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.